recreationing. Do you see my t-shirt? So usually I wear my priestly robes, which in my tradition is a button-up shirt. So I'm illustrating deep recreation right now by being in a t-shirt. It's quite something. Okay, so many of you know that I was born and raised in Calgary, but our family I went to seminary in Vancouver, and then we spent 11 years in Los Angeles as church planters and running a coffee house until the U.S. immigration, pre-Trump, go figure, pre-Trump U.S. immigration said, you're not welcome anymore. So we came back to Calgary, the loving arms of Calgary, even though we hadn't lived here in over 15 years, because it's where we were. Well, honestly, it's because that's where mom and dad were, and that's where a hot meal and a place to stay in a basement was. Anyway, so not knowing what to do, kind of having our life off a little bit, I started as an interim, not an intern, but an interim pastor at Hillside Community Church, one of the parents of the road. And but it was a 6-month position, and my narrative was, right after this, we're going back to Los Angeles. But then that didn't work, and we fell in love with the church, and hopefully that was mutual a little bit, or they were like, well, the devil is better than, I don't know. But I was called to be a pastor, so I started in earnest in July of 2012 as the pastor of this little church, Hillside. And there's a difference between being an interim pastor, right? You're holding the fort for 6 months versus, okay, you're a pastor in this church. You need to do something. So my sense is like, okay, I need to prove my worth a little bit now, right? It's time to go. Again, this is July 7 years ago, right? So right then I'm like, all right, now it's time. But I remember it deeply that I kept trying to okay, let's start some small groups, let's start some church activities, let's do this, and kind of started, calling numbers and sending emails and all this kind of stuff. And I got the very clear message back, dude, we don't do stuff in the summer in Calgary. You don't do church programming. Don't start something. We'll have a service. We might make it to the service. We'll make one or two in the summer. You don't start stuff in July. And it was a profound change for me, right? In LA, there are no seasons really. People's vacation time, for some people it's this, for another people it's a different time. But it was this learning, there's in this place, something we all share, there's a particular rhythm, right? We have long winters and we have short summers. So when summer comes, we take advantage of it. The sun is out late, and we want to be out late. We want to, for me, what does it look like? Floating down the river, going camping, getting into the mountains, going for walks, going for jogs, sitting outside with coffee and enjoying eating and drinking with friends, all that stuff, right? Summer is the time for recreation. I think that's kind of a cultural, and I think it's kind of a good cultural thing about Calgary. So, I got to find where I am here. I wanted to start with just the word recreation. So the word recreation it's kind of obvious, right? The etymology, recreation. And it's funny, you do if you go into etymology and you do a word search and they're like, it's from the Latin creare and the which means again. But yeah, it's obvious, like create again, be created again, recreation. So it's kind of a cool word, but it's also kind of a word that is sort of seems like the most biblical theme like you could possibly imagine. Even though it's not a Bible word, it really seems like it could be a Bible word. So creation, the whole story of the Bible, right, is creation is made good, something goes wrong, and it's marred with sin. I'm too energetic, so I am going to stand up after all, if that's okay. Plus, I need to see Michelle there. I'm just kidding. Keep an eye on you. So the story of the Bible is kind of recreation. So if you take the very narrative, creation is made good, something goes wrong, it's marred with sin, death, and suffering. That's what we all experience. We know that's here in this world, even though we think creation is good. But God's response to that is not to destroy creation, but to make it new again, to recreate it, right? And new creation is sort of the theme of the whole project that the Bible is about. So right from the time of Adam and Eve, when they find themselves outside of the garden, the promise is already there. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to leave you or forsake you. I'm going to remake you and remake the entire world. And there's a bit of a brief blip in that with the Noah story, if you know that, when God says, well, maybe I will destroy the world and just start over again. But again, I think the point of that Noah story is the promise at the end. That's what we're supposed to remember when we remember the Noah story, that the rainbow and the promise, where God says, no, I'm never going to do this again. Wiping the slate clean and starting over is absolutely off the table. That's kind of a big deal, right? That God says, I'm not going to say no more, no matter what you do. I'm not going to say no more and be done with it and start over. I'm going to remake what's here. So us, our brokenness, our wonderfulness, all of it, God says, you're the stuff I'm going to remake. And to that end, in the biblical story, God chooses a people. To that end, God gives that people his law to reflect him. To that end, God gave them the promised land to be a sign and a symbol of what recreated reality might look like and how we might live as recreated, made new people. But that's kind of an interesting case because that didn't actually work out very well. They didn't do a good job at showing the world what being new creations looks like in the promised land. So they lost the land instead. But God didn't go the Noah way. He didn't abandon, he didn't forsake, he didn't say, okay, I'm done with this project. He said, okay, you're out of the land, but we're going to start over again. God said, I will not give up. I will redeem what's mine. I'm not going to abandon. I'm going to redeem. I'm going to recreate. And so to that end, you hear all the prophets. And the prophets are kind of the hugest part of the entire Old Testament, if you read through it. But again and again, the prophets start sounding the promise of God's recreation of all things, both to remind people what he's up to and point them to a future when he's going to have a new covenant with his people, and instead of giving them laws and rules to follow, he's going to write his law on our hearts, and we're going to be new creatures living right in his shalom. I heard the other day, yesterday actually, in a lecture, that the most prevalent the most in Jesus' day, in the synagogues of the Mediterranean world, so in the diaspora, the most popular scroll that was found in synagogues, any guesses? Psalms? Nope. Isaiah. Yes. It was Isaiah. And actually, and not just Isaiah, because, Isaiah's big, right? So you need a few scrolls. But the last third of Isaiah was the most popular passage or scroll that Jews in Jesus' day were reading and listening to again and again. It kind of makes me think, we should do a series on Isaiah here coming up in the fall or something like that. And what does the book of Isaiah says? It says, God is remaking all things. God will restore his people. Though you've been rent from him, God will bring you back and into relationship with him. It's to that end of recreation that the whole biblical story is moving and going. And then, of course, that's exactly the logic of God showing up in the person of Jesus. And in Jesus, God demonstrates that even the worst possible example of what human beings or creation could come up with, basically the most broken, awful, shameful stuff, a death on a cross, the murder of an innocent, even in that place, especially in that place, God is wanting to recreate, remake, resurrect, bring resurrection out of death. God brings something out of nothing. And it's not just for Jesus that God says, I'm going to do this recreation. It's for all of us, and it's for the cosmos. And then to that end, Jesus' last move, so that's the ultimate picture of recreation. And then Jesus' last move, in terms of his earthly ministry, his last move, is to give us his Spirit. And what does he say? He says, behold, I am making all things new. and he kind of gives them the Spirit and says, and now it's on you. So behold, I am making all things new. Here's my Spirit. You're the agents in that recreation. So anyway, so that's fair, right? Have I made my case well enough that recreation is a biblical theme? Hopefully. Okay, so we don't think of that stuff, though, when we use the word recreation very much at all. But I love the idea of recovering the etymology of words. Kind of like, when we do communion and we're called to remember. I had somebody tell me once, and it's impacted me ever since, that it's basically you have all this bread, and in giving it to us as we take the bread, the body and blood of Christ, he's remembering us, constructing us into the body of Christ ourselves. We're being remembered. Anyway, so recreate. So I like recovering words like remember and recreate. And you think of other words like holidays. So another way to talk about vacation or recreating is holidays, but they're holy days. But wouldn't it be cool if we actually saw them like that in our own lives? So it's not just, we're going on a trip to Waterton. It's like, these are holy days spent with family and loved ones in God's creation. Holy days where God is present. Isn't that a better way of thinking about that? Isn't that a more grace-infused, spirit-infused way as opposed to our, deterministic, materialistic, we're just doing it because we have money to go on a trip. It's better than that. And that's kind of been the point of this series that we've been doing in church, is we've sort of been trying to, for the summer, is we're trying to be kind of sort of acknowledge that sometimes people aren't here, people are out doing all kinds of things, and those are the places where God is present, and those are the places where we're invited to participate in what God is doing just as much, sometimes even more, than what we do on Sunday morning. Okay, so if you saw the e-news blurb, I mentioned words that the dictionary gives as synonyms for recreation. And some of those are pleasure. Again, I'm going for like robust, theological, beautiful idea of recreation, recreation, this biblical theme that we do all the time. So pleasure, that seems shallow. Leisure, relaxation, like, yeah, but fun, okay. Enjoyment, that's a little better because enjoyment, there's a theological root there. Entertainment, that's the worst. And same with amusement. Like, is that what we're doing? Is that what we want? Refreshment, that's good. I want to be fresh again. I want to be new again. Restoration, that's a good one. All things being restored, made new, made whole again. Distraction, terrible. Diversion, terrible. Play, like it might involve play, but that's shallow again. Sport, R&R, yeah. Jollies, okay. Pastime, hobby, leisure activity, leisure pursuit, leisure interest. Again, I'm hoping we can go a little deeper. So what are some of the ways that we use the word recreation in our culture? I could think of two, typically. What? Shout it. Recreational drinking. Yeah, that was one of the ones I thought. Recreational drug use or recreational. But then again, if you think of the question, it's a weird thing, right? Recreational drug use. So recreate, is your drug use like recreating you? Then I guess it's recreational. But anyway, and the other one I thought of was recreation centers. And there's something to that, right? Like if you go to work out and swim laps or whatever you happen to do, you're kind of building yourself. You're being recreated there. Any other instances? Recreation? Recreational vehicle, yeah, that's good. Okay. Recreational vehicle, I guess that can get you out to be recreated. Very good. Okay, so my hope this morning is that we'll sort of do like that we're just kind of doing like a custom theology, so that what we all leave here is a greater sense of what we're doing, or what we could be doing, how we could be looking at our own R&R, our own rest and relaxation, our own activities in the mountains, golfing, playing soccer, swimming, sitting, all of these wonderful things. So a couple notes on Bible words. So we talk about creation a lot, right? You're not surprised in a sermon to, if somebody references creation as a noun, and you assume that when someone says creation, it's kind of a theistic thing, right? It's not just the world, it's the world that God holds in his hands. So we talk a lot of it. There's the word for creation in the New Testament is ktisis. It's a fun one. And it appears 18 times. And it's usually like from the foundation of the world, or from the very act of creation. That's where it gets used. The word creation, this might surprise you, occurs 0 times in the Old Testament. Like 0. And I'm cheating a little bit, because there's 2 other words. So there's no noun creation, but the verb to create is there all over the place, right? So then there's 2 verbs. There's bara and yatsar. One is to make and one is to form, and there's an argument of whether they're synonyms or not. But it's all verbal. Creation is all verbal in the Old Testament, except for 13 times, which is not very much in a massive book. 13 times there's the phrase the heavens and the earth, like in the day that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. So you could kind of say that the heavens and the earth is creation. Anyway, I'd be happy to be challenged on that. But the word creation itself, 0 times in the Old Testament. So I already reported that, so making all things new, though, is a biblical concept, even if it's not in the Bible. And that's why I want to highlight and celebrate the word recreation, even though it's not in the Bible. It's a good word. So yesterday I was listening to this lecture with Rick Watts. He used to be a prof at Regent, and now he's back in down under in Australia. And he was basically talking about how, in his view, despite the fact that the fastest growing religion in North America is none, like unaffiliated, despite the fact that atheism is on the rise, his argument was that nevertheless, the modern world is only as good as it is because of the gospel. And so we kind of had that like Pinkerton argument of, the better angels of our nature, that if we look at the world, is in fact a better place, and it's because of, he argues, the gospel, that the gospel has actually shaped and changed the world. So he said basically the fundamental thing that something that we all take for granted as human beings is we all know and we all believe, and even our political enemies on television believe and would say the same thing, that all human beings have intrinsic worth and dignity, right? That's just a given. Like, there's no discussion where you have to argue someone into believing that humans have worth and dignity. I hope not. There's not very many places where that happens. But that wasn't the way that humans were for thousands of years. That was not an assumption. The idea that we should envision a place where there's human flourishing and we are all walking hand in hand. I mean, nobody does it. We're still waging wars and doing terrible things to each other. But at least the vision that all human beings should and could flourish and be cared for and well and happy and in good relationship with one another is something that's a new vision for humanity. And Rick Watts was saying this is something that's rooted in Christianity itself. And it comes from this idea, like when the Hebrew Bible came along and said, we are made in the image of God. It's in his image that we're made. We're image bearers. That was a revolutionary idea. If you think about that against the context and the backdrop in which that was given in Egypt, where you work, you're subhuman. You work, you're here to make bricks. And if you die making bricks, you die making bricks. There's more of you to come after that. You work, you're oppressed, your only function is to serve power, to serve empire. And that's basically been the way of the world for most of the world's history. And yet in Christ, this one who lays his life down while that empire is crushing him, demonstrates a different way of being. And from that, you get the one who whose self empties himself of his self for others, gives rise to this community of believers who sees slaves and those in power and those who are slaves as equals, as brothers and sisters. It's a radical different way of conceiving of community, and it changes the world. And it's why today we have concepts. It's on those building blocks that we've built things like democracy and human rights and all these good things. All right, so maybe you agree with this argument, maybe you don't, but I did have a little slide of it's the human rights one, the little article. So in case you ever need to, in the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, there is, did I delete it? Oops. Well, anyway, Article 24 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights talks about recreation and that people should be given a paid leave from their work that they do. Again, this is a new thing. It's not like everybody should know this. Well, everybody should know this, but that's a new thing in the history of the world. And there's something, the reason I'm talking about all this is to get this idea that when we're reading the Old Testament, when we're reading the New Testament, a lot of the things, especially the Old Testament, a lot of the things that are presented there are polemics. So in other words, the whole world is a certain way, and the Hebrews tell this nice little story about God and what he does. And it's like, that's an interesting story. And sometimes we think, well, so what's the moral life lesson? But maybe what's actually going on in that story is it's saying, oh, you think the world is like this? No, the world is like this. And one of the places where you see that most clearly, the one we fight about all the time, is our creation story. So a lot of people will say, oh, and Jackie preached on the Enuma Elish, a lot of the people will say, oh, that Hebrew Bible story is derivative of, ancient Near East creation myths, and it's actually taking on some of the language that they've used already. This is nothing new. It's not very innovative at all. But that misses the entire point. Of course it's innovative. It's saying, oh, you think the world is ordered and structured like this? No. Let us tell you the same story using some of those same pieces in our story. Let's tell you, and to reveal this is what God is really like. This is who God really is. He's the one who gives human beings dignity, who breathes his breath into them and says, you matter to me. And who says, I am going to bring all this creation into restoration in me in shalom. Anyway, so things are polemical. Article 24 from the UN resolution. Rick Watt's point was that even atheists believe in human dignity and worth. Good stuff. This is why you don't go from just notes. In Egypt, you were breaking bricks. Polemic, Old Testament. I remember where I was. So in that context, that's kind of how I think we should read the giving of God's law. So when God gives the people his law and his 10 commandments, the fourth law has recreation, relaxation, and rest built right into it. Because the fourth commandment is the commandment about Sabbath, right? For 6 days you can work, but on the seventh day you must rest and keep it holy, because in 6 days God created the entire heavens and the earth. He did his work, but on the seventh day he rested. And that's great. It's in the 10 Commandments, of course, but it gets repeated in Scripture in the Old Testament a lot, again and again and again, in so many different contexts. So another interesting thing I learned this week, another scholar who I don't have a slide of, Walter Brueggemann, who I love, who's really good to listen to. Walter Brueggemann, and he's an Old Testament scholar. So he was talking about this. He's looking at Exodus 25 to 31, and he basically, his thesis was Exodus 25 to 31 is the part when you make a New Year's resolution and you're like, I'm gonna read through the entire Bible this year. Exodus 25 is the time when you give up your resolution because because it's so boring and tedious. And maybe you can, if you get a running start, you might get into it, but it's hard. So there's all these tedious instructions on building the tabernacle, the ark, how the rings are going to go, how the embroidery is going to go, the fabric that's there, the dimensions, the building materials, all this kind of stuff. God gives a series of mini speeches to Moses about how he's supposed to do all this stuff. And then it sort of gets reprised again in Exodus 35 to 40, where now it tells the same thing in the same excruciatingly painful detail of Moses actually doing the things that God just told him to do in these mini speeches. The point is, in Exodus 25 to 31, there are 7 mini speeches that God gives to Moses, corresponding with the 7 days, build this, do this. And the 7th one is God's instruction to Moses to keep, that the people, for not just Moses, but the whole people will keep the Sabbath and keep it holy. And there's some threatening words there too. And if you don't, you're going to die, and the people will put you to death. It's a bit harsh. But the point is, for this morning, rest is right there in the law. It's built in. It will be a sign, and this is verse 17. It says, it will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day, and this is key, he rested and was refreshed. Now basically every English version says rested and refreshed because they don't know what else to do with it, including KJV, including everything else. But in the Hebrew, it's a bit scandalous because the word rest, that's not scandalous. It just means stop, cease, desist, over. And Brueggemann's point was like, God doesn't seem to be terribly anxious about not showing up for work on a given day. He's fine with it. I'm just going to rest. I'm going to stop everything. And for us, this is an aside, as Sabbath keepers, one of the reasons to stop working for the workaholics among us is to stop and recognize that all the activity that we generate, we are still dependent on what God does. It's God's work that we want to get in on, not create our own thing. And Sabbath helps us remember that. Anyway, so the word rest and refresh. Rest basically means stop, but refreshed, naphash. Naphash. It's a good word. And it's used when someone's soul or self, and the soul or self in Hebrew is kind of the same word. Like, so bless the Lord, O my soul, is the same as like bless the Lord, O my self. It's pretty much the same. And it's when myself is depleted or emptied, and I need to be refreshed, and I need to breathe deep and get refreshed, which basically literally means to re-self. So the way Walter Brueggemann put it, and he said, forget about the classical ways in which this sounds bad theologically, but that this is God, it's saying God was re-selfed. God got his self back in Sabbath. And that, of course, that has a little bit of scandalous. What? God needs self back? The Net Bible, the notes there basically say the same thing, and it says, this is a, quote, this is a bold anthropomorphism. Right? So making God sound like a human. Yeah, it is, exactly. God re-selfed. And God wants, and God commands that we also rest, re-self, recreate, to naphash. That's your vocabulary word for the week, to take that. So what does that mean? It was 7 years ago, speaking of sevens, 7 years ago, this very month, in July, that I learned that Calgarians hold summer as sacred time that should involve recreation and should involve recreation and should involve naphash and breathing deep in the air that God gives us to breathe, recognizing that everything is gift. It is a time for hiking in the mountains and floating down the river and visiting breweries and clinging beers with friends and enjoying the evening sun and all the rest of this. And I want to learn to do that better for me, because oftentimes I go into the default mode instead of recreating in the presence of loved ones, church members, family members. I go for entertainment, those amusement, pleasure, that empty, shallow stuff. But we can actually hitch those activities that we do, those activities that you do, during the summer, you can actually hitch those to a beautiful theological wagon where we're actually participating in something that God himself does, something that God invites, commands us to do, because we, like God, can breathe deep and get resalved through our recreation.